Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to express my gratitude to the amazing Elaine Cobb, who has been promoting the idea of family and the importance of a family for children. I've taken part in a couple of webinars and interviews, and she's now asked me to speak about the threats to the family from all sides. My background is that I was qualified as a lawyer in England. I moved with my family to Israel in 1978. I requalified as a lawyer. And in 1995, I was appointed a judge of the Jerusalem Family Court. I served in that capacity for 17 years. And after taking early retirement, I've been researching and writing and lecturing on a variety of topics to do with children, separation of parents, what happens to children when parents separate and divorce, how the systems in many places are inadequate properly to cope with the issues that arise and the potential damage to children if the parent separation is not done properly, and also about improving the ways in which family courts handle cases involving children. I'll go into that a little later. But underlying much of my work is the perception that, particularly recently, in the last maybe 20 or 30 years, the concept of family has gone through tremendous changes. And as a result, many people find it very difficult to understand how they ought to be behaving towards their partners, their spouses, and particularly towards their children and their parents. And my purpose is to try and isolate some of the reasons for these threats to the family and to suggest ways in which we may be able, each one of us, to offset these threats and make life better for families and for children in particular. The underlying feeling I have is that human nature requires, for the proper upbringing of the next generation, a stable family structure. This involves traditionally a father and a mother and the children, grandparents, uncles, aunts, and a wider family. And that, unfortunately, in many places, has been damaged and has become inappropriate in the eyes of some. The reason why I feel that the child can properly grow up in an environment where he has parents who love him, who are together, who love each other and respect each other, is because that is founded in human nature. It is the nature of human beings to want to make connections. It's in the nature of human beings to want to produce offspring. And that is really the underlying feature of my philosophy and my professional work and the work I do in training and education. I want to quote a gentleman called Rafi Eiss, who wrote the following about the Bible, Orthodox Judaism, and sexual virtue. But it applies not only to Judaism, it applies to all the Abrahamic religions, and I'm sure to many other cultures. He wrote as follows: "The Bible offers a profoundly wise resource in thinking about sex. Though it's a book of divine revelation, it is deeply consonant with our nature and demonstrates penetrating understanding about the human soul and how to achieve happiness, even in matters pertaining to our sexual nature. At creation, the Bible charges man to be fruitful and multiply. And in the next chapter, it says that it's not good for a man to be alone, which directly leads to the mandate that a man should cling to his wife so they should become one flesh. As Abraham's descendants grow from family into a nation, the emphasis on family remains. It is a book of revelation whose teachings align with human nature, human biology, and the human condition. The Bible guides us to live with how the world works. Its goal is to support human potential and increase human flourishing. The Bible promotes the centrality of marriage because humans need companionship and continuity. So from this, we can see, and particularly in the biblical narrative of the book of Genesis, we see how families form, but we also see how families can become dysfunctional. In the very first chapters, we see how Cain kills Abel. We see the rivalry, which can break down into open enmity and warfare between Isaac and Ishmael, between Jacob and Esau. And we see how the brothers, the sons of Jacob, have disagreements leading to them ostracizing Joseph and sending him for 22 years to Egypt, and the suffering of his father as a result. But the fundamental unit is the family. And as I'll show, that is under threat from various directions. There is another area or another way of explaining this. The human development, the child develops by attachment. First of all, to the mother, the father, and then to siblings, grandparents, and then there's another ring. We're talking here of concentric rings surrounding the child, and each of the members of those rings is involved and influences and can affect the development of the child. So we have the most inner of those rings, the parents, then we have siblings, uncles, aunts, grandparents, and then around that we have the wider family, what you might call the clan. Then you have the community in which the child grows up, and at the end, the most outermost ring that a child or a person can perceive as being influenced by is the nation. And the nation shares usually a common language, a common history, a common culture, with all the variations and all the differences of the different groups within the nation. And so it is going towards the center. And at the center is the child, who is being influenced by the outer rings and is growing into a socialized human being as a result. If you take away any of those rings, then the child's development may be adversely affected. And that's why leaving aside any religious or biblical origins or influences or impressions, we see this in the way people grow up. If you want to go back into the history of the United States, there was a French philosopher called Tocqueville who visited the United States in the middle of the 19th century. And he talked about the importance for the state, for the nation, of small groups, small groupings. If we perceive a state as consisting of the government, can be the federal or the state government at the outside and the individual on the other side, there is a need for other organizations or other structures which can protect the individual from the excesses of the state, but can also protect the state from the influence of individual troublemakers. And Tocqueville spoke about the family, but also voluntary associations, including clubs, including religious groupings, as essential to the proper development of a nation and of a state. So we can see that this is separate from the religious core, but is no less important. So the family is the basic collective which enables a society, nation, to function properly. There's another area as well, and that is that an individual does not exist in terms of the time scale at a specific moment without regard for the past and for the future. The structure of the family ensures that a person grows up understanding that he has a past, a personal past, which is influenced by his parents and his grandparents, and those grandparents, and he the natural inclination is to look to the future. What's going to happen afterwards? What's going to happen when I get old? Who's going to look after me? But also, what values and what history am I going to pass on to the next generations? So when I sit with my family, I tell them that I remember my grandfather, who was born in the 1870s. I now have a great-grandchild who was born in 2022, and I hope he will live for many, many, many years. So we're talking about a position of each individual in his own history, but in the history of his family and in general history. So if the family is attacked or attenuated, then a person is liable to lose that perception of his place in history. And I suggest that the history of a person is very important to him, and it's something that he ought to be involved in. So that's setting up the reason why I feel that families are important. And we're now going to look at the threats to the family from the outside and from the inside. I've entitled From All Sides. We're not talking about north, south, east, and west, but we are talking from the external threats, and then we'll talk about the internal threats. So among the external threats are the general philosophy and the general mores, the moral constructs that we live according to. And it's my understanding that over the last few decades, there has been an attack. In some cases, it may be deliberate. In some cases, it may be totally unwitting on the concept of the family. And this comes from several places. I want to talk a bit about the idea of rights and responsibilities. For the last 250 years or so, we are used to a discourse which is based on rights. The United States Declaration of Independence, of course, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, the French Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen, and a whole host of national legislation and international conventions and treaties and agreements are all talking in terms of rights. I think rights are wrong. I know this will sound controversial to many of my listeners, but I've been thinking about this for many years. The central problem is that rights are individualistic, they're egotistical. It's about what I am entitled to, and take no account or little account of the responsibilities of the individual to other people. This, I would say, affects the way we perceive the family. There are unfortunately many people who enter into relationships for what they can get out of them, and they take little or no account of the effect of their actions on the people with whom they enter into relationships. I can tell you as a judge that I often had to deal with cases in which there was a disagreement between the parents about how the child should be educated or what medical treatment the child should have. And the one parent would say, I have a right to decide what happens to my child, and I want the child to enter this form of education. The other parent would say, no, I have a right, because I'm the child's parent, to decide what's going to happen. And then someone would come along and say, well, what about the child's rights? I'll deal with children's rights very shortly. And I was forced to tell the parents that they have no rights regarding the child's education. They are responsible for the child's education together because they are the parents of the child. They took on themselves when they decided to have the child, or even if they didn't decide to have the child, but the child came along, they have a responsibility to make sure the child receives the best education for that child's needs. So instead of talking about the individual thinking of the mother or the father, of the parents, as to what's right for this child in these circumstances, I would ask them to consider the needs of this specific child, what the alternatives are for education of the child, and if necessary, of course, consult with an expert, and not consider their rights. And in many cases, that helped to resolve the issue at stake, because the parents who appeared before me were encouraged to look outside themselves. But the problems of a discussion of rights, these problems are much more widespread than the family, the individual family. And while I have no intention in this discussion to talk about group rights and to talk about the issues of human rights and civil rights, these have been very helpful in some areas in expressing what's needed in societies and generally in the world. But it is far more fruitful, in my opinion, and far more healthy to talk about responsibilities, people's responsibilities to each other, people's responsibilities to society as a whole. I want to talk a little bit about the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. In a lecture I gave several years ago, I said that really ought to be reformulated as the Convention on the Responsibilities to Children. One of the issues of conventions about rights are that they don't designate who is responsible for making sure that the person who is entitled is actually going to receive what that person needs. And therefore, I suggested that we should be talking about the responsibilities that individuals, parents, of course, first and foremost, but other people have to children, and the responsibilities of the state to children. So that, for example, the responsibility of the state is to allow parents to bring up children in the way in which those parents see fit, a responsibility of the state not improperly to interfere in the way parents bring up children. And we'll see maybe a little later what happens when the state takes over parental tasks without justification. That, of course, does not mean that parents are free from interference, even if they are maltreating the child, abusing the child, or neglecting the child. In that case, the state has a responsibility to intervene because the parents are not fulfilling their responsibilities. But even in those cases where child protection authorities may be involved, the state still has a responsibility to the child and to the parents to interfere as little as possible. That is to say, to discover what the abilities of the parents are, to make sure that the child receives everything he or she needs within the family. If that's not possible, then to provide for alternative placement for the child, a foster family, or in an appropriate children's institution. But that is limited to the minimum amount of time needed in order to help the parents to rehabilitate themselves, and then the child should go back under supervision if necessary to be looked after by those who have the primary responsibility for the child. Clearly, there are cases in which parents are so impaired that they cannot bring up the child, and in that case, the child may need to be taken away and placed with an adoptive family. But again, the issue here is that the responsibility of the state includes to intervene where necessary, but only to the minimum extent necessary in order to provide for the healthy development of the child. Framing that in terms of rights is inappropriate and leads to all kinds of distressing results, as I've seen being in family law for many decades. So the idea of rights is one of the threats to the family if it's taken to extremes, as it sometimes is, and we ought to be reframing our conversations in terms of responsibilities. What that means in practice is that we should be educating our children, our youngsters, our adolescents, to consider their responsibilities when they are interacting with their parents. A child should respect the parents, but the parents should also respect the child. So far as the child is capable of expressing an opinion, that opinion ought to be taken into account by the parents in making decisions. That doesn't mean that a child has a right to decide about his or her own future in matters for which the child is not properly equipped because of immaturity, because of lack of information, or lack of the ability to process information. You don't, if you take your 5-year-old child and say, right, we're going to have a vaccination. What's a vaccination? Well, the nurse is going to take a sharp needle and stick it in you, and it'll hurt for a little bit, but we need to do it. The child who has his rights will say, no, I have a right to the integrity of my body, and I have the right to decide, and you can't take me. Now, the parent's response, of course, has to be, it's not up to you. We're going to do this because it's for your own health. We don't want you to get sick. And you'll get a nice candy and a toy after it's finished. Because it's not the child's right to decide about medical issues, because the child is not equipped for that. Similarly, if your 14-year-old daughter goes out and you say, you know, I want you home by 11 o'clock, and this adolescent says, no, I have a right to move about freely and you can't stop me. that is a challenge to parental authority. And a child who grows up in that kind of atmosphere of being allowed to do what they want to do simply because they want to do it, when they are clearly ill-equipped, both in terms of their knowledge of the world and their ability to look and see what the possible results of what they're doing, what the results might be, we do them no favors. We do not advance the interests of that child by giving the child the power to make often long-term decisions. We have to bring them up in such a way that when they reach majority, when they reach the age of 18 or 21 or whatever it is, then they're free to make whatever decisions they want. The process of parenting includes educating and enabling the children when the time comes to make proper decisions. But the emphasis here is when the time comes and not while they are still too young. But as I said before, we have to take into account what the children say, how they say things, and what the influence is liable to be, and how we take those things into account. In other words, what weight we give them in weighing up what's the appropriate decision. That is the responsibility of parents to take into account the needs of their children. And that is part of the discourse. The discourse should be in terms of responsibilities and rights. We can get on very well, I think, living together without rights. So those responsibilities of parents, of course, start at conception. That's why I am advancing programs for adolescents, high school kids, that they should be taught about relationships, about the importance of their responsibility to the partner, to take account of the needs of the partner and the particular character of the partner, to learn about the partner's character in order to set up a proper relationship in which to have children. It is unfortunate that many couples, youngsters, get together and without really considering the responsibility to each other or to the future generation that might be born, they engage in relationships which may lead to an unwanted child. And at that point, as we've seen in many communities, the couple then break up because they were together for reasons which had nothing to do with responsibilities. And as we see in many communities, children are liable to grow up without a father, with a mother who is herself a child in the terms of the law. And we see the effects of that in all kinds of areas of life, including the welfare system, including the education system, including all kinds of other evil effects of having children without regard for responsibilities to couples, to the members of the couple and to the child. And that is another external threat relating to the idea of responsibilities and the idea of rights. There's another area also which threatens the family. That is the extent to which the education system and the public press, the social media, and so on, present parents as being unimportant or as having outdated ideas and thereby ruining the proper relationships and the proper hierarchy within the family. I can give an example from a curriculum in school. According to the way I see things, the parents have a responsibility to educate their children. I've already said that. They, of course, hand that off to the school system. But the school system is simply the agent of the parents. Unfortunately, in many places, the government, local government, state government, federal government, has imposed on schools what they are allowed to teach and what they're not allowed to teach. And that, of course, infringes on the autonomy of the parents to determine how their children shall be educated. The result is that a child who is being taught a particular topic which goes to religion or relationships or state may end up disrespecting the parent and feeling that the parent really has nothing to say. The parent is unimportant because the education system is purveying a system of values and a view of history which is different from that of the parents. So again, we come back to the source of the issue, the importance of the immediate family and then the wider family, and later on, or more widely, the clan and then the nation. But the relative importance of those parts of the concentric circles we spoke about has to be very carefully weighed. And if we cause an imbalance in that by, in the example I gave, of a child being taught in a way which is different from or contrary to the values of the parents, then we are disrupting the family and we are causing children to turn away from their parents and their immediate family. And that is a very serious threat from the outside to what's going on in the family. There are other issues here, of course. There are those who say that a family is an oppressive institution. There are those who say that a family is inappropriate, that the state should take responsibility for bringing up children. These are all ideas which unfortunately are current in some circles. But again, I go back to the same presentation. If we look at the responsibilities of the parents, first and foremost, and the responsibility of the state and other organizations to stay out of the bringing up of children, except where interference is necessary in the best interests of the child, and only to the extent that it's necessary, then we can avoid some of these external threats. I want to talk now about the internal threats to the family structure. And we've spoken about the idea of responsibility of an individual to his or her partner. The institution of marriage exists in practically all societies. Of course, there are variations, but the underlying conception is, I think, that there needs to be some permanence in the relationship between a man and a woman. There needs to be some permanence in the relationship between the partners, and that can be better ensured by setting up a structure called marriage, which has legal ramifications. It has legal effects on how you get into it and, of course, how you get out of it. We've seen that children who grow up with parents who are not married, where there is no long-term commitment of the parents one to another, they often end up without contact with one of the parents, or with one parent taking over practically all the tasks of bringing up the child. And it is this which can bring about a disruption in the proper development of the child. So divorce is also part of the marriage structure in most religions. There are religions in which divorce is not allowed. There are those in which divorce is very much allowed, when one partner can divorce the other partner without any justifiable reason. And the laws of divorce are being changed from time to time over the last many years. The idea of no-fault divorce, while it sounds very attractive, is, in my view, a threat to families, because it makes the exit of one of the partners from responsibilities to the other partner, and unfortunately, in many cases to the children, too easy. There needs, in my view, to be a regime in which separation and divorce need to be properly conducted in the interests of the child. A child grows up believing instinctively that he will have a stable home, one home. When parents separate, there are by definition two homes. And when the child is exposed to arguments and strife between the parents, then the child internalizes an idea of couple relationships which is unstable and which is characterized by arguments and even violence. And that is not the parents who are fighting among themselves present a very poor role model for the child in that child's future. So what I am advocating for is an arrangement in which, where parents decide they're going to separate, they go to a counselor, or they go to a therapist, or they go to a wise person who can tell them how to do it in such a way as to minimize the effects on the child. The child is affected by the separation because what he dreamt about, of a stable relationship and one home and mom and dad together, that is destroyed. But it makes a great difference if that can be conveyed to the child in a proper way, taking account of the developmental stage of each child and the personality of each child, or whether somebody walks out slamming the door, or the police take a parent away, and then there is an acrimonious litigation afterwards about what's going to happen to the child. So divorce itself, while it may be inevitable, and it may indeed be in the interests of the child not to be exposed to a tense situation in the family, nevertheless, it has to be done properly. And unfortunately, the press and the social media are full of stories about the divorces of people who are influencers, and divorce has become, unfortunately, very common. So the way in which we handle separation and divorce needs to be, the separation and divorce need to be handled very carefully in the interests of the child. So we're talking here about an internal threat to the individual family by the selfishness of the couple. We go back to the issue of rights and responsibilities that we spoke about. This leads on to another threat to the family, which is what we might call lawyerization or judgification of the separation process. As we know, the process of separation and divorce are very often, maybe usually, characterized by the need to go to a court and to deal with things. Sir Andrew Macfarlane, who is the president of the family division of the High Court in England and Wales, the top family judge, has said recently that maybe a very high proportion, maybe a majority of cases that come before the family court have absolutely nothing to do with law. Courts are there to decide issues of law. They're to decide disputes and decide who is right and who is wrong. That's inappropriate for most family situations. The couple decided to form a family together. They have children. They now want to separate. The relationships need to be adjusted. They need help for that. But the idea that you have to file a claim in court saying all kinds of nasty things about the person whom you loved and who was your partner, instead of applying to some properly qualified individual who can discuss the processing of the breakup of the marriage, the process of mourning, the end of a relationship, the dreams which were not fulfilled. The idea you need a lawyer to deal with that, whose training is in analysis of conflicting facts and learning about the law and trying to prove claims and, of course, fighting in the battlefield or the boxing ring that is a courtroom. Lawyers are not necessarily the right people to handle these issues. So while we've spoken about the fact that separation and divorce may be necessary for some couples, the lawyer should come into the picture, if at all, at a much later stage. Here we're talking about encouraging people, as I say, to go to therapists and to go to counselors. We are talking about encouraging them to resolve their discussions by mediation, by working collaboratively, because at the end of the day, the interests of children have to be paramount. How you define those, of course, may be an issue. And where there have been incidents of abuse, violence, and so on, which are disputed, then the court legitimately has to deal with those issues only if the effects of that alleged violence are liable to impinge on the life of the child. But we should not get carried away about these things. Violence is to be deplored in any shape or form. Violence can be physical, it can be verbal, it can be sexual, but it can also be psychological. And psychological abuse is often a part of the separation of couples if they don't do the separation properly. And there is a particularly vile form of abuse, psychological abuse, and that is when one parent influences the child to have no contact with the other parent and that parent's family. That is sometimes called alienation. And where there is an allegation of abuse of a child, an allegation of physical or sexual or other abuse or of psychological abuse, then that needs to be determined in a court of law. But it has to be determined in a special way because family cases are different from other cases. The reason for that should be clear. Where in a case where there's a collision between two vehicles and someone is injured, then usually the parties did not know each other before the incident happened, and after the lawsuit is finished, they will never see each other again. And where there's a contract between parties that has been breached, then the parties before the contract probably didn't know each other, and after the thing is resolved, they'll not need to know each other again. That's not the case in families. In families, there is a whole history leading up to the allegation of abuse or neglect or maltreatment, and the parties will remain in some way or other connected together, certainly while there are minor children, but also after that. This means that courts have to be designed in such a way as to deal quickly and therapeutically with the issues of where there are allegations of violence, and not allow the trials to drag on forever and ever like any other civil case. That is the fact that or the perception that difficulties in families have to be dealt with, all difficulties have to be dealt with by lawyers and courts, that is a threat to the idea of family, because we are orienting people into fighting, into adversarial things, where they need to be oriented towards resolution of conflicts. The conflicts exist, but they can be resolved in many cases without going to a court, without going to a lawyer, by mediation and by other methods. So those are some of the internal threats, because the children are, of course, the victims. There are adult victims as well, but we have to keep our eyes on our responsibilities to our children, and that involves specifically the parents and their families, but also society as a whole and the state. So the question now is, what can we do? What can each individual do in order to remove these threats, or at least minimize and offset the effects of these threats? So at the public policy level, we have to encourage people, everybody, to think about responsibilities and duties within the context of families, and not to concentrate on individual rights. We have to make sure that our press, our media, our legislators are expressing a proper concern for the family as being central to the healthy development of the individuals and to the healthy existence of the nation. And we have to use whatever influence we have in whatever way in order to change the way in which we look at families and we look at family separation. So it's not based on blame, and it's not based on winning, losing, defeating, crushing, victory. Those are not words, those are not concepts which are appropriate when there is a family with children and they're going to live together or separately, but they're going to be influenced by each other and influence each other in the future. So there's a need for a change in the words we use. There is a word called custody, which can mean that a child is in the custody of one parent and not of the other. That, in my view, is not the way we should look at how we handle the life of a child after the parents separate. The parents remain responsible for the child even when they're living separately. They have to divide up the responsibilities in a different way from that which they had when they were living together. It's important that all professionals who deal with children and their families should understand not only the importance of the family, but also the need to resolve conflicts and differences in families in a proper way. That means that people in schools, teachers, school counselors, and school administrators, it means that nurses and doctors and social workers and psychologists and anyone who comes into contact professionally with children and their parents should internalize the importance of family and the importance of responsibilities, the importance of working together in order to produce the correct resolution and the best future for the children. It involves prevention of harm to a child. That itself requires that people understand the effects of separation and divorce on a child, the effects of improper behavior by a parent, which can cause unbelievable stress and very difficult prognosis for the physical, mental, and emotional health of the child. But it means also that those professionals who look after children or involved with children, their parents, should be able to identify the early signs that a child is adversely affected by strife and disagreements within the family, in order to call in the parents and explain to them and help them get the assistance they need in order properly to resolve their issues and their problems, their conflicts, and also to get therapy for the child if the child needs therapy as a result of the adverse effects of parental separation. So we're talking about early identification and immediate intervention. We're talking also about multidisciplinary work. It means that those organizations and those individuals who are responsible for children should be working together. They should know each the abilities, the powers, the responsibilities, and the limitations of the others, so that people who are involved in child protection should be considering how best to resolve the issues between the parents if those issues have caused the child to need protection. It means that police who intervene in cases of family violence should be aware of the effects of their actions on the children. It means that the threats to the mental and physical and emotional health of the child as a result of the actions of all organizations, all state agencies, all voluntary agencies should take into account the effect on children and in that way to minimize the threat to a child's welfare. And when it comes to the court should be properly equipped, both in terms of trained personnel, judges and administrative staff and others, to consider what the child's needs are, because if the court case is handled in a way which is inappropriate, not only are there bad effects on the child, but there are bad effects on the way the child perceives the idea of family. And here we're talking about the threats to family. And one of those threats is, as I've said, the ways in which some courts mishandle cases involving children and destroy the child's faith in the institution of family. That is, as I've said, the institution of family is essential for a child's healthy development and welfare. So we've spoken about the threats to family. There is, of course, much else to be said on these topics. We've spoken about the threats from the outside, from the way society views the family, and the way influences of all kinds have distorted the conception of family. Just one final point. I just read some very interesting research from Europe. Nearly 100,000 children were involved in this survey, and it was clearly proven that the death of a parent, while terrible in its own way, has a far less detrimental effect on the educational achievements of the child than divorce and separation of the parents. In other words, the importance of parents to a child is given. But when a child's parent dies, at least there is no conflict involved, and the child can, in a healthy way, with help as necessary, overcome the grief and the sadness, and can look back on the deceased parent as being an important part of his or her upbringing. But where there is a divorce and the child is presented by one of the parents or both of them with a picture that the other parent is bad or evil, or the other parent is incompetent, and that parent still exists and is still alive, that's one of the ways in which we can explain the importance of family, if we can assume that the educational achievements are going to affect the child throughout his or her life. So that's it. I've made some brief suggestions as to how each individual may improve the perception of family, and I'm of course available. My email address appears, and anyone who wants to get in touch with me, anyone who wants to see my articles or to talk about training for professionals is welcome to be in touch. Again, my thanks to Elaine. That's it for now.